Basement wine cellar, crime scene isolation and discovery analysis. We've traced flashlights that bore no prints and pineapple that collapsed carefully constructed timelines. We've examined practice notes that required hours and maternal hearing that should have detected what neighbors heard from greater distance. And now we need to descend. Literally and metaphorically, we need to follow the path down into the basement, through the maze of storage areas and utility spaces, to the small room at the very back, the wine cellar tucked away behind other rooms, isolated from the main living areas by layers of space and material. Because here's what sits quietly beneath all the staging we've examined, beneath the ransom note and the closed windows and the careful evidence management. She was found in perhaps the most remote, most isolated, most acoustically separated location in that entire house. And this choice of location, not random, not accidental, but the selection of this specific space among all possible spaces, tells us something crucial about what was being managed during those hours, about what sounds needed to be contained, about whether we're looking at concealment or at staging that required privacy, that required distance from where parents supposedly slept unaware. Let's establish what we understand about the wine cellar's location within the house's architecture before we begin to interpret what that location means. From a forensic perspective, the wine cellar was about as far from the master bedroom as you could get while remaining within the house. 2 floors separated them vertically. Horizontal distance separated them as well, not just a straight path downstairs, but through basement spaces, past other rooms, to a back corner location. And the wine cellar itself was small, enclosed, a room within the basement, rather than part of open basement space. This configuration, distance, layers of separation, enclosure, creates specific acoustic properties, specific isolation from the rest of the house. Understanding these properties helps us understand why this location rather than another, why the most remote corner of the house rather than any of the many other spaces where events might have concluded. Theme 1. The architecture of isolation. What distance and enclosure reveal. When we think about the wine cellar's position in the house, we're thinking about layers. From an architectural perspective, sound travels differently through different materials and across different distances. It attenuates, becomes quieter, as it passes through walls, floors, the various barriers between source and listener. And the wine cellar's location meant sound generated. There would have to travel through maximum barriers to reach the master bedroom, through the wine cellar door and walls, through basement space, upstairs, through multiple floors and walls. Each barrier reducing volume, each distance attenuating further. From a physiological standpoint, this creates circumstances where sounds that might be quite loud at their source become barely perceptible or completely inaudible at distant listening points. And this property, this acoustic isolation, becomes significant when we ask why this location specifically, why the most remote corner of the house for events we've been told involved an intruder operating in hostile territory. Let's think about what other locations were available and what their selection would have meant differently. From a logical perspective, if an intruder was moving through that house with a child, if events were unfolding that led to terrible outcomes, many locations would have been more accessible, would have required less navigation through unfamiliar spaces. The main floor offered numerous rooms. The basement itself had other areas. But the wine cellar, specifically, that required knowledge of the house, required navigating to the most remote corner, required choosing isolation over convenience. And that choice tells us something about priorities. Was isolation chosen for concealment, hiding what was happening from discovery? Or was it chosen for containment, ensuring sounds wouldn't reach where they might trigger investigation? From a criminological perspective, these are different motives, different calculations, and the choice between them reveals different things about who was making decisions and what they were trying to accomplish. From a psychological standpoint, let's consider what it means to select the most isolated location in a house. Someone unfamiliar with the layout wouldn't naturally navigate to the wine cellar, wouldn't know it existed, wouldn't understand the house's geography well enough to identify the most remote corner. But someone who lived there, who knew every room and passage, who understood which spaces offered maximum separation from where other family members might be, that person would know the wine cellar provided isolation that other locations didn't. They would understand, perhaps not consciously, but through daily familiarity, that sounds generated there would be least likely to travel to bedrooms upstairs. That distance and barriers would create privacy even for terrible sounds that might escape during whatever was occurring. This knowledge, this geographic fluency, speaks to residents rather than intrusion, to someone navigating their own familiar space rather than hostile territory. Now, let's consider the wine cellar's characteristics beyond just distance. From an anthropological perspective, wine cellars serve specific functions in homes that have them. They're storage spaces, specialized rooms for keeping bottles at appropriate temperature and humidity. They're not living spaces, not areas where daily family activity occurs. They're liminal, part of the house but separate from its lived zones, spaces you enter for specific purposes and then leave. And this liminality creates psychological as well as physical separation. What happens in such spaces feels disconnected from what happens in the main living areas, separated not just by distance, but by function, and by the psychological boundaries we place around different types of space. If terrible things needed to occur somewhere, if someone was processing impossible circumstances and making unbearable decisions, the wine cellar's liminality might have made it feel like the right location precisely because it was separated, not just acoustically, but psychologically, from the spaces where normal family life unfolded. Let's shift to thinking about what the isolation meant for what could occur there versus what could occur in more accessible locations. From a physiological perspective, if struggle occurred, if sounds were generated that parents sleeping upstairs would normally hear and investigate, the wine cellar's isolation provided what other locations couldn't, the possibility that such sounds wouldn't reach their intended listeners, wouldn't trigger the parental response we've examined in earlier chapters. This doesn't mean sounds were deliberately generated, knowing they'd be contained. It means that if sounds occurred, whether through struggle, through distress, through the terrible circumstances of whatever unfolded, the location provided a kind of buffer, a spatial cushion that reduced the likelihood those sounds would penetrate to where sleeping parents might wake and investigate. And if someone was choosing a location with awareness that sounds might be generated, awareness that containment was desirable, the wine cellar would offer what other locations couldn't. From a philosophical perspective, we need to ask, what's the relationship between physical isolation and psychological isolation? When we separate ourselves spatially from others, we're also separating ourselves psychologically, creating distance not just in feet, but in awareness, in connection, in the felt presence of other humans. The wine cellar's isolation might have served this psychological function as well as its acoustic one. It created a space where someone could be alone with terrible circumstances, where decisions could be made and actions could be taken without the immediate psychological pressure of proximity to other family members. Not because those family members weren't in the house, they were, sleeping upstairs, but because distance creates a kind of psychological insulation, allows us to do things we might not be able to do if we felt the immediate presence of others who would witness or judge or interrupt. The isolation becomes both practical and psychological, serving needs that extend beyond simple sound containment. From a criminological standpoint, let's consider what the location choice tells us about planning versus reaction. If we accept the intruder narrative, we're asked to believe someone unfamiliar with the house somehow navigated to its most remote corner. But from a logical perspective, intruders don't typically seek out the most isolated locations in unfamiliar houses. They operate in spaces near their entry and exit points, in areas they can navigate confidently, in locations that don't require extensive knowledge of layout. The fact that she was found in the wine cellar, the space requiring maximum familiarity to even know existed and to navigate to, suggests not an intruder's choices, but a resident's knowledge. Someone who understood the house's geography, who knew which spaces offered isolation, who could navigate even in darkness to the most remote corner, because they had traveled those paths countless times before. The location becomes evidence not just of where events concluded, but of who had the knowledge to choose that location specifically. So when we step back and consider the architecture of isolation, the layers of distance and barriers, the acoustic properties, the psychological separation, the specialized knowledge required to navigate to that specific location, we're looking at evidence that the wine cellar wasn't randomly selected. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the choice of that specific location reveals someone operating with geographic fluency, someone who understood what that space offered in terms of isolation and containment, someone for whom navigating to the most remote corner of the house wasn't a challenge, but simply a matter of following familiar paths to a space whose properties they understood. The distance wasn't obstacle, it was feature, selected precisely because of what that distance provided. And that selection, that choice of maximum isolation within the house, becomes one more thread suggesting not an intruder navigating hostile territory, but someone deeply embedded in that space, choosing from intimate knowledge a location whose properties would serve purposes that required separation from the rest of the house, from the places where parents supposedly slept, unaware that terrible things were unfolding in the most remote corner of their home. Theme 2. The question of purpose. Concealment versus staging. We've established that the wine cellar's isolation was significant, and now we need to think about what that isolation was meant to accomplish, because the location serves different purposes depending on what was actually occurring during those hours. From a forensic perspective, if the goal was concealment, hiding what had happened, buying time before discovery, then the wine cellar makes a certain kind of sense. It's remote, isolated, a space that family members wouldn't necessarily enter regularly. But if the goal was staging, creating a scene that would be discovered in a way that supported a particular narrative, then the wine cellar's remoteness creates problems. Discovery becomes less likely, requires someone to specifically search that space, doesn't create the natural flow from one finding to another that good staging typically requires. So which was it? Was the location chosen to conceal or to stage? And what does the answer tell us about the mind making that choice? Let's think about what concealment would look like and whether the wine cellar serves that purpose effectively. From a psychological standpoint, if someone was trying to hide what had happened, to delay discovery as long as possible, they would want the most remote, least accessed space available. The wine cellar fits this profile. It's not a space that would be entered during normal morning routine, not a location that would be discovered naturally in the course of daily life. But here's what creates tension. If concealment was the goal, why stage at all? Why spend hours writing a ransom note? Why create elaborate narrative? Why engage in the extended evidence management we've examined? From a criminological perspective, concealment and staging serve different purposes. Concealment seeks to hide indefinitely. Staging seeks to control how something is discovered and interpreted. And the wine cellar's selection, combined with all the staging we've documented, suggests someone operating in the uncertain space between these purposes, wanting delay, wanting control over discovery, but not wanting indefinite concealment because eventually discovery would have to occur, and the staging needed to be in place to shape that discovery. From an anthropological lens, let's consider how different cultures and contexts understand the relationship between hiding and revealing. Sometimes what appears to be concealment is actually staged revelation. The object or person is hidden, but in a way that ensures eventual discovery under controlled circumstances. The wine cellar might serve exactly this function, remote enough to provide time, isolated enough to allow staging completion, but ultimately findable when someone specifically looked there. Not concealment seeking to permanently hide, but strategic placement providing temporal buffer. This interpretation aligns with what we know about that morning. Parents initially didn't find her. Search occurred, and eventually someone opened that wine cellar door and discovered what was staged there. The location provided time for discovery to unfold in phases, for initial staging elements, the note, to be processed before the final discovery occurred. Now let's think about what the staging in the wine cellar actually consisted of and what it tells us about purpose. From a forensic perspective, the scene that was discovered showed signs of construction. Items positioned, elements arranged in ways suggesting narrative rather than natural conclusion of events. The white blanket she was wrapped in, the positioning of her body, various elements that seemed designed to suggest certain interpretations rather than simply reflecting how things ended organically. From a psychological standpoint, this staging required time, required someone to be in that space, engaged in construction, rather than simply in panic or flight. And that time investment makes sense only if the staging served a purpose, if how the scene would be read mattered to whoever was constructing it. The wine cellar became not just the location where she was lost, but a stage, a constructed scene meant to be discovered in particular ways that would suggest particular narratives to those who would eventually enter that space. Let's shift to considering what the act of staging in that specific location reveals about the stager's state of mind. From a physiological perspective, spending time in a small, enclosed space with what had happened, with the reality of loss and the terrible necessity of creating some kind of explanation or framework. This requires a particular kind of psychological compartmentalization. Not everyone could do it. Not everyone could spend extended time in that wine cellar, arranging elements, constructing narrative, managing what would eventually be discovered. But someone in a dissociated state, someone operating with the fragmented consciousness that extreme trauma can create, someone for whom the immediate reality was too unbearable to fully process, that person might be able to engage in the mechanical tasks of staging while holding the emotional reality at a distance. The wine cellar's isolation might have made this psychological management easier, the physical separation from the rest of the house mirroring the psychological separation required to do what needed to be done. From a philosophical perspective, we need to think about what it means to construct meaning around what cannot have meaning, to create narrative around what defies explanation. The staging in the wine cellar might represent exactly this: desperate attempts to make sense of the senseless, to create a framework that would explain what couldn't be explained through simple truth. Not because the stager was calculating and cold, but because the human mind, faced with unbearable reality, reaches for structures that make reality more bearable. If what happened was accidental, if one child took the life of another without understanding or intending the finality of it, how do parents process that? How do they face the reality that both children are lost? One physically, one to consequences that would follow from truth. The staging might emerge not from cold calculation, but from desperate need to create alternative reality, where both children might somehow be saved, where the family might survive what would otherwise destroy it utterly. From a criminological standpoint, when we see elaborate staging combined with remote location, we typically interpret this as someone buying time to complete the staging, time to prepare themselves psychologically for what comes next, time to ensure all elements are in place before discovery initiates investigation and scrutiny. The wine cellar's isolation provided that time. It meant the initial discovery, the note, could occur separately from the final discovery, finding her, allowing the narrative established by the note to shape interpretation before the physical evidence was confronted. This sequential discovery, this phase-by-phase revelation, serves staging purposes that immediate discovery in a more accessible location wouldn't serve. It creates frame before content, establishes interpretation before evidence. That interpretation is meant to explain. The location becomes integral to how the staging functioned, to how narrative and evidence were meant to interact, to create the impression that was desperately needed to redirect investigation away from unbearable truth. So, when we consider the question of purpose, Whether the wine cellar was chosen for concealment or for staging, what that choice reveals about the mind making it. We see someone operating in the impossible, space between hiding and revealing. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the location served multiple purposes simultaneously. It provided isolation that allowed for staging completion without interruption. It created acoustic separation that meant sounds generated during staging or during whatever preceded it wouldn't reach where they might trigger investigation. It offered temporal buffer between initial discovery and final discovery, allowing the note to establish frame before the physical evidence was confronted. And it reflected the geographic knowledge of someone who understood the house intimately enough to know where maximum isolation existed, who could navigate to that space even under extreme stress, for whom the wine cellar wasn't unfamiliar territory, but simply the most remote corner of a thoroughly known geography. The purpose wasn't simple concealment or simple staging. It was the complex intersection of both, serving needs that emerged from circumstances so terrible that only distance, only isolation, only the most remote corner of the house could provide the separation required to do what the terrible hours between loss and discovery demanded. Theme 3, the discovery sequence. What finding her there tells us. We've examined isolation and purpose, and now we need to think about discovery itself, not just where she was found, but how that finding unfolded and what the sequence reveals about who knew what and when. Because discovery isn't neutral, isn't simply a matter of opening a door and confronting what's there. From a forensic perspective, the circumstances of discovery tell us about the discoverer's state of mind, about whether finding was genuine surprise or confirmation of what was already known, about whether the location was truly being searched or whether navigation to it reflected prior knowledge of what would be found there. And the wine cellar discovery, when we examine it closely, creates questions that have never been satisfactorily answered about who knew, who searched, and whether the finding was the revelation it was presented as or something more complex. Let's think about what genuine search of an unfamiliar location looks like versus what search by someone familiar looks like. From a psychological perspective, when people search for something they desperately hope to find but don't know where to look, they typically search systematically, starting with most likely locations, working outward, becoming more thorough, as initial searches prove fruitless. But when someone knows where to look, when they have information about the specific location where something will be found, their search behavior is different. They might search other areas first to establish the appearance of genuine seeking, but the search that leads to discovery often has a quality of inevitability, of moving toward a specific destination rather than exploring genuinely unknown territory. The wine cellar discovery has been described and analyzed extensively, but the question that sits beneath those descriptions is this: did the person who found her navigate to that remote space through genuine search process, or did their path reflect knowledge about where she would be found? From an anthropological lens, we need to understand that homes develop paths of typical use, areas that get accessed frequently, and areas that remain relatively unused except for specific purposes. Wine cellars fall into this latter category. They're not spaces entered daily, not locations that factor into normal household traffic patterns. So, when someone searches a house and eventually navigates to the wine cellar, we need to ask, what prompted searching that specific space? Was it systematic thoroughness? Having searched everywhere else, this was the next logical location to check? Or was there something that drew attention specifically there? Some knowledge or suspicion that made the wine cellar a target for search, rather than just one of many possible locations? The answer shapes our understanding of whether discovery represented genuine finding or confirmation of what was already suspected or known. Now let's consider what the discovery itself reportedly looked like. The opening of the door, the reactions described, the immediate actions taken. From a criminological perspective, people's responses to discovering what they claim not to have expected tell us about whether the discovery was genuine surprise. Genuine surprise creates specific physiological and behavioral patterns. Shock, delayed processing, sometimes even denial about what's being seen because the mind resists accepting unexpected horror. But discovery that confirms what was already known or feared creates different patterns. Grief perhaps, horror certainly, but without the sharp edge of complete surprise, without the disorientation that comes from confronting utterly unexpected reality. Those who have analyzed the discovery accounts have noted elements that suggest perhaps the finding wasn't the complete surprise it was presented as, that perhaps whoever opened that door had some level of awareness or suspicion about what they would find there. Let's shift to thinking about what happened immediately after discovery and what those actions reveal about consciousness and preparation. From a physiological perspective, the immediate response to discovering a child who has been lost is typically to attempt intervention, checking for signs of life, attempting to help, engaging in desperate efforts to change reality even when reality has already become unchangeable. But the actions reportedly taken after the wine cellar discovery included moving her, bringing her upstairs, actions that from a forensic perspective compromise the scene and make investigation more difficult. Whether these actions emerged from genuine, desperate hope that something could still be done, or whether they served other purposes, further contaminating evidence, creating chaos that would complicate forensic examination, is a question that has never been definitively answered. What's clear is that the scene, as investigators ultimately examined it, had been significantly altered from how it existed at the moment of discovery, and that alteration shapes what could and couldn't be determined about what occurred in that space. From a philosophical perspective, we need to think about what it means when the location of loss becomes also the location of staging, when the space where something terrible occurred becomes also the space where narrative is constructed around that occurrence. The wine cellar served both functions. It was where events concluded, and it was where staging occurred to shape how those events would be interpreted. This dual nature creates interpretive complexity. Some elements of the scene might reflect how things naturally were when they ended. Other elements might reflect staging done afterward to suggest different narratives. Separating these layers, what was organic versus what was constructed, becomes nearly impossible, especially after the scene was further compromised by the moving of her body and the contamination that occurred during and after discovery. The wine cellar keeps its secrets, maintains ambiguity about which elements were natural and which were staged, creating space for multiple interpretations that has made definitive forensic conclusions difficult. From a criminological standpoint, let's consider what the wine cellar discovery means for the overall staging we've been examining. The note was found early on the stairs, creating initial interpretation that a kidnapping had occurred. For hours, that interpretation dominated. Police were called, friends arrived, the house became a scene of supposed ransom situation. And only later, after the note had established its framework, after the kidnapping narrative had been absorbed and was shaping everyone's understanding, was she found in the wine cellar. This sequence, narrative first, evidence second, allowed the note's interpretation to color how the physical evidence was read. Instead of finding her first and having to explain the note in light of that finding, the finding occurred in a context where the note had already shaped expectations. From a staging perspective, this sequence might be exactly what was needed. Let the note do its work of directing interpretation before the physical evidence that might complicate that interpretation is discovered. So when we consider the discovery sequence, how the finding unfolded, what it reveals about knowledge and preparation, how the timing shaped interpretation, we see the culmination of what the wine cellar's selection accomplished. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the location served purposes that extended beyond where she was lost to include how she was found and what that finding meant for investigation. The wine cellar provided isolation for staging. It created acoustic separation for whatever sounds might have occurred. It offered temporal buffer between the note's discovery and her discovery, allowing sequential revelation that shaped interpretation. And it became the final stage in a night of staging, the place where someone or multiple someone spent time arranging, positioning, constructing the scene that would be found when discovery finally came. Whether the person who opened that door knew what they would find, whether the search that led there was genuine or performative, whether reactions were surprise or confirmation, these questions may never be definitively answered. What's clear is that the wine cellar, the most remote corner of that house, became the place where terrible truth and desperate staging intersected, where what actually happened and what desperately needed to be believed happened, coexisted in a small, isolated space, waiting for the moment when someone would open that door and the final phase of discovery would begin, setting in motion everything that would follow: investigation, suspicion, decades of questions about what really occurred in that basement room during hours when the most isolated corner of the house served purposes that required exactly that isolation, that distance, that separation from the places where parents supposedly slept, unaware. We've descended into the wine cellar through 3 layers of understanding. Isolation that required intimate geographic knowledge, purpose that served staging more than concealment, discovery that unfolded in sequences that shaped interpretation. What emerges isn't certainty about every moment that occurred in that space, but recognition that the location itself tells a story through its remoteness, through its acoustic properties, through its selection as the final stage for staging that had occupied hours of that terrible night. The wine cellar wasn't chosen randomly. It was selected by someone who knew the house intimately, who understood what that space offered in terms of separation and containment, who could navigate to the most remote corner even in darkness because those paths were thoroughly familiar. Someone who needed isolation, needed distance between where terrible things occurred and where parents supposedly slept, needed acoustic separation so sounds wouldn't trigger the maternal response we've examined, needed time and privacy to complete staging that required extended presence in a small enclosed space with the unbearable reality of loss. The wine cellar becomes the final location in our journey through that house, the end point of a night that began with pineapple in a kitchen and ended with discovery in the most remote corner, accessible without leaving the house entirely. And its remoteness, its careful selection, its service as both location of loss and location of staging tells us that whoever chose that space understood what it offered, knew the house well enough to recognize its most isolated corner, and had reasons that required exactly that isolation, that distance, that separation from the rest of the house, where family life had always unfolded and where, after that night, nothing would ever be the same. The wine cellar keeps its secret still, maintains ambiguities about what occurred there and what was merely staged there, but through its very remoteness, through its selection over all other possible locations, it whispers truths about knowledge and access and the terrible geography of a night when the most distant corner of a house became the final chapter in events that no staging could make less devastating and no distance could make distant enough.